Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today we're adumbrating the first half of Chapter 5, Colonial Society on the Eve of the Revolution, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, start us off.
Of course. So in 1775, there were a total of 32 British colonies active in North America. Only 13 of these 32 had revolted or will revolt in the American Revolution. Canada and Jamaica were wealthier than the original 13 and larger. Some of the colonies were larger, wealthier, different. Okay? In all the colonies, though, there was this exponential population growth due mainly to the natural fertility of the Americans. The Americans were reproducing like crazy. The vast majority, around 95% of the Americans, were crammed east of the Allegheny Mountains, okay? So they're more along the coast than farther east in the midland of North America. By 1775, though, a few had settled in Tennessee and Kentucky, so we had the beginnings of that. 90% of Americans lived in rural areas, so most of them were farmers. Now, Frank, could you tell me, how did the different races in America mingle together?
Absolutely. They mingled, in short, very well. So colonial America was mostly English. It's about 49% English, but that means that 31% is other things. So we naturally have other minorities in the area. So Germans make up 6% of the population, or 150,000 people by 1775. They were called Pennsylvania Dutch, a perversion of the German Deutsch. Also, the Scots-Irish made up 7% of the population, or 175,000 of the Americans by 1775. The Scots-Irish were important because they never really felt at home in their own country, so they came over to America and emigrated to fight off and stave off the Catholic Church. So they typically moved inland in from America, contrary to what Abe was pointing out. These guys were America's frontiersmen, and once they became those frontiersmen, they naturally had clashes with Indians and other white settlers who had settled the land before them, since they were known as squatters. They didn't have legal rights to that land. The Paxton Boys are an excellent example of Scots-Irish men taking a revolt or a march and being violent with it. So during the Paxton Boys Rebellion in 1765, like the Nathaniel Bacon Rebellion of earlier years, 100 years earlier, these people were frustrated at not having official land. As I said, they were squatters, and they revolt against the central authority. But that's put down. And then later, we see them in the regulator movement, which is a revolt against the Eastern authority. Because these guys, they see themselves as more frontiersmen, these Scots-Irish, and they don't really have to answer to central control. So they were hot-headed but hardy people. And when the War for Independence began, a few years later, many of these people became revolutionaries. In fact, 5% of more people besides the Scots-Irish and Germans were also part of minorities. We had French Huguenots, we had Welsh, we had Dutch, we had Swedes, we had Jews, we had Irish, we had Swiss, we had Scots Highlanders. So America is a quilt, a melting pot of different races and different cultures. So even early on, the Americans are taking on this mosaic of races and ethnicities, and therefore other nations have a hard time pinning down exactly what it means to be American. So Abe, once these immigrants got to America from wherever they were coming from, was there a class society, or how was society structured?
Okay, so unlike Europe, where most of the classes were kind of locked in place and there was no mobility, America was a land of opportunity. Hard work might mean anyone could rise from the rags to the riches, or from being poor. Yes, the American dream. The social ladder overall was very open in America. But despite the opportunity in America, class differences did emerge, with wealthy plant farmers, clergymen, government officials, and some wealthy merchants wielding a lot of the authority. They kind of became this top class of society. Wars brought more riches to merchants. Basically, they earned large profits as military suppliers. And these wars, as well as creating riches for the merchants, created widows and orphans who then relied on charity from the state for support. In the South, the riches from the growing slave population were not distributed evenly, and they led to the development of some very wealthy slave owners, basically large plantation owners. This widened the gap between these plantation owners and the poor, who were these white tenant farmers. The indentured servants that came to America often were the very poor people and the criminals that were sent to the New World. Some of them were actually unfortunate victims of Britain's unfair laws. Britain had a bunch of different crimes that classified as capital that would send you to be expelled. So basically, some of these indentured servants that were kicked out of Great Britain did come to be very respectable citizens in the New World. This group did dwindle after the 1700s, but that was mostly because of Bacon's rebellion and the move away from indentured servant labor and the move towards slavery. Black slaves were at the bottom of the social ladder, and they had no rights or hopes of moving up or even getting freedom. Slavery became a very divisive issue because the colonists tried to halt the slavery importation. They noticed that the Southern colonies feared that with so many blacks, the chances of rebellion were much higher. Britain, though, vetoed the efforts for halting the slave importation because they wanted to preserve the cheap labor supply in the Americas to keep the cost of their raw materials down. Now, Frank, could you tell me how were clerics, physicians, and jurists viewed in American society?
Yeah, so in this section we're looking at an example of 3 different jobs and kind of where they placed at this time in the society of New World America. So at the top we have the clergy, or priests, and they were the most respected group in colonial days. As Abe pointed out, they were kind of losing power at this time, but they still held a lot of respect, still held in high esteem, but a little bit less authority by the time we get to 1775. Then we have, for example, physicians or doctors. And these guys, they're not really looked upon with as much respect as clergy, because many of them were little more than witch doctors, such as what we saw during the Black Plague. They didn't really cure people. All they wanted to do was let blood run out until it restored a balance to your body.
Very logical.
Yes. Or use perhaps leeches on your face to suck out the poisons. Ooh. So such medicines made it so they didn't garner that much respect for the public. In fact, even after a smallpox inoculation was discovered in 1721, many doctors and clergy still refused to prescribe it because they felt they'd be interfering in God's work. And then another example, we have lawyers here. And lawyers they're looked upon with scorn at this point in time. They're looked upon as scoundrels and time wasters, because criminals would often represent themselves in court rather than getting a lawyer. So lawyers are simply looked upon as bringing new issues to the court and obscuring the justice and the law. So we talked about a bit in the last chapter about how different jobs had different statuses in the eyes of the common man. But what was life like for the average worker in America?
Okay, so basically agriculture in the Americas was the dominant industry. And in the Chesapeake and, of course, Maryland and Virginia, tobacco was the staple crop. In the middle colonies, the bread colonies, wheat was the staple crop. New York exported 80,000 barrels of flour annually. Basically, as Kennedy states, the farmer would basically tickle the land with his hoe. And then the land would laugh with harvest. That's basically what would happen. Fishing and whaling was also very prosperous in New England, and trade began to flourish. Commercial ventures and land speculation were the 2 best paths for wealth. Yankee merchants were active, and they were known as these hard dealers, okay? And they often used these methods of commercial ventures. The triangular trade developed and was in operation. In it, basically, a ship would, 1, depart from New England with rum. They would arrive in the west coast of Africa and trade the rum for African slaves. They would take those slaves and 3, go to the West Indies and exchange the slaves for molasses. Okay, then they would take the molasses back to the New World, use it to grow rum, and then they would start the cycle all over again. Manufacturing was not as important, but there were a variety of small enterprises. Again, agriculture was dominant. Good laborers were hard to find, and once they were found, they enjoyed these special privileges. A carpenter who was a murderer was set free just because of his valued woodworking skills. At the top of the manufacturing industry was lumber. It was fueling the high demand for shipbuilding that was put on the Americas. Naval stores were also used, like naval stores as in like turpentine and tar, were used to build and repair the British Navy. The British Crown reserved these best, the British Crown was heavily reliant on these because if they didn't have the Americas, they would have to rely on the unreliable Baltic area. The British Crown even reserved some American trees to be used as the masts on British ships, and this was actually very bothersome to the Americans. Okay, so basically what happened overall was the America's fast-growing population demanded more and more British products, but the slow-growing British population had reached a saturation point. So what the Americans did, they turned to foreign markets, like they started selling tobacco to the French. The British didn't like this, so they passed the Molasses Act, which is basically this tax on the West Indies molasses, and with the aim of squelching the trade with the French and other foreign ventures. And the Americans they circumvented the Molasses Act by bribing, using bribes and smuggling to go around the act. So the Molasses Act turned out to not be a big problem, but it did foreshadow more taxes and more troubles to come. Now, Abe, could you tell me what was going on with horsepower and sail power? What were the different methods for travel?
Yeah, so as Abe was talking about, there were different methods to transport and trade throughout the different world, the New World, Africa, the Caribbean. And several of these new ways relied on successful infrastructure to transport those products to and from their destination. And unfortunately, America didn't really have this at this point. Roads were scarce and pitifully poor. Until the 1700s, they didn't even connect major cities like Philadelphia and Boston. Roads were dust bowls during the summer, and during the winter, they turned into mud bogs. It wasn't reliable at all to get from point A to point B as long as you were using these dusty, inefficient roads. For example, it took Benjamin Franklin 9 days to get to Philadelphia from where he originated, even though where he originated was a mere 100 miles away. So nowadays, you could do that in a couple of hours. Think about 60 miles per hour. That means you're doing 60 miles in an hour. But for Benjamin Franklin, it took 9 days to get all the way to Philadelphia. So that's how bad the infrastructure was at this point. And he wasn't only going by roads. He was also going by sailboat and rowboat. So that puts in perspective how slow news traveled, how slow everything traveled back then. So travel by water, either by coast or via rivers, was common and useful since it was better than the roads. It was more reliable because you couldn't get bogged down in water. The water always moved at the same speed. So taverns begin to spring up along these roadways since it takes so long. And the taverns serve a number of useful purposes. The book points out that taverns were a birthplace of democracy, since it was a place where ideas could be freely exchanged between the common man. Additionally, taverns served as a place for a night's sleep, and also as a place to get a refreshing beverage. A crude mail system also began to emerge. However, this was also unreliable. As we pointed out, the road system was poor, and in fact, sometimes the couriers of the letters got so bored during the trip that they would open up and read the letters for themselves. So, Abe, what avenues were open to the common man in terms of religious participation?
Alright, so in 1775, on the eve of the Revolution, there were two established churches, okay? Or churches that received tax money. So we had the Anglican and the Congregational. But surprisingly, a large portion of the American population didn't worship in a church, however. They had their own separate religions. The Anglican Church, or the Church of England, basically, was the official faith in Georgia, Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, and part of New York. The Anglican brand of religion was basically more worldly. It differed than the Puritan New England. Sermons were shorter, and hellfire was, of course, less hot. But they gained such a bad reputation that the College of William and Mary was founded in 1893 to train clergymen to better represent the Anglican Church. Anglicans didn't have an American bishop to ordain or appoint the American clergymen. So the idea of starting this American bishopry was popular, but it was violently opposed by non-Anglicans as the Revolution drew to a close.
So on the other hand, we have the Congregational Church, which grew out of the Puritan Church, the Separatist Church. So it was established in each New England colony except for Rhode Island. If we remember back to when we observed this bold term in the past, we'll remember that the Congregational Church was appealing because it didn't have a hierarchy of bishops and priests and popes. So that's why it appealed more to the common man. This also enabled Presbyterianism, which was basically the kin of Congregationalizationism, which was common but never an official religion like the Congregational Church. So religion, which used to be a burning issue in New England, was beginning to take a backseat to politics because we're seeing priests get less official power.
Thank you for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode.